One of the most important things you can do when buying a new MacBook is configuring it with the right amount of RAM. Too little and performance will suffer, too much and you're just wasting your hard-earned cash. Not to mention Apple solders the RAM on their MacBooks, so it can't be upgraded later on if you change your mind. So here I have 3 different M2 MacBook Airs with no other upgrades apart from RAM. There's an 8GB, a 16GB, and 24GB model, and hopefully by the end of this video, you'll know which one you should go with. If you're in a rush and need a summary, here you go. But I do encourage you to watch this whole video because I do go into a lot more detail and explain exactly when and where you should upgrade. So firstly, it's really important to understand how the RAM is used on these Apple Silicon MacBooks, because it's actually a little bit different to traditional laptops. If you didn't already know, RAM stands for Random Access Memory, and its purpose is to provide your computer a place to store information it's actively using so that it can be accessed quickly. Imagine a builder using a tool belt. The more slots or gigabytes of RAM his tool belt has, the more tools or data he can store in it for quick access. RAM is essentially the exact same thing. However, where Apple Silicon MacBooks differ from typical laptops is that they use something called unified memory. And this means that not only are your programs and apps using the RAM, but the actual components on your MacBook are as well, like the CPU and the GPU. And depending on what you're doing and how many apps you have open at once, all of these separate things can compete for the available RAM. So, who is fine with just 8GB of RAM? Well, a lot of people actually. Many MacBook Air users don't push their machine hard enough to warrant the extra cost of upgrading to 16GB of RAM. Here's a pretty typical scenario in my opinion. If you have 10 browser tabs open, some emails, a Word document, a large PDF document, 100,000 row Excel spreadsheet, Spotify and Slack, all running at the same time, I didn't really notice a difference between 8 and 16GB of RAM, because the DDR5 memory Apple uses on these MacBooks is incredibly fast, and macOS is quite good at utilizing something called swap memory once available RAM is used up. And for those of you asking, no, I don't believe the additional swap usage in this scenario will significantly shorten the lifespan of your SSD. And if you do want to learn more, I did make a video on this topic that I will link. Also, even if you do something more intensive every now and then, like some video editing or possibly even compiling some code, 8GB will still be able to get it done. So don't feel like you have to upgrade. Now, that being said, just because 8GB may be fine for you, doesn't necessarily mean you should choose that option. There are quite a few situations where I definitely do recommend getting at least 16GB of RAM, especially if you're going to be pushing this machine a little harder than just web browsing and emails. For example, just running the macOS operating system itself uses over 3GB of RAM before you even open any other apps or programs. I've always said that going with 16GB of RAM is one of the best upgrades you can make because it gives you that extra headroom for future-proofing or in case you're using a particularly RAM-intensive app or doing tons of multitasking. So with that being said, let's have a look at how the different RAM options compare. Starting off with some creative workflows, in general, if you're doing anything creative, you're going to have a much better experience with at least 16GB of RAM. Now, starting at the top, music apps like Logic Pro can often be bottlenecked by the CPU, so you may not see a big difference. But this really does depend on your workflow. I mean, if you have tons of different music libraries or large Ableton projects, for example, you should consider upgrading the RAM. Unfortunately, I don't have the skill or knowledge to go into depth for music production, so I do recommend doing some further research on your specific workflow and the specific apps and plugins, for example, you're going to be using. Moving on, pretty much anything Adobe related will benefit greatly from the extra RAM. Adobe apps are typically pretty RAM hungry at the best of times, and as you can see here, are anywhere from 30 to a whopping 50% faster with 16 gigabytes of RAM. Now again, all of this really depends on your specific workflow. I mean, I've seen some pretty complex RAW files in Lightroom eat up over 30 gigabytes of RAM, for example. Moving on to video editing, obviously you're not going to be doing anything super intensive on this machine, but some basic and even more complicated timelines up to about 4K resolution work pretty good. So a good indicator of how the RAM options compare is by using something called Puget Bench, which puts the MacBooks through a series of real-life timelines, renders, and workflows, and gives you a score at the end. At first glance, we can immediately see the 16GB RAM option is about 24% faster than 8GB. But the 24GB RAM option doesn't really see that much improvement over 16GB. And this is why I don't recommend upgrading to 24GB of RAM here. It's just too expensive and you'll get diminishing returns when compared to 16GB. And at this point, it is better to simply get the 14-inch M1 Pro MacBook if you're doing frequent video editing. When it comes to rendering though, the M2 chip has those fancy hardware encoders and decoders, which typically don't really rely on the GPU or RAM, as long as you're using a supported codec, which I think most people will be. And that's why there's barely any difference here. There are some instances where the extra RAM does matter, but again, I don't think many people are doing this level of video editing on this machine. But like I always say in these videos, rendering is only a tiny fraction of your work. I mean, you'll spend 95% of your time in the timeline actually editing. And that is where you will notice a huge difference between 8 and 16 gigabytes. For 3D workflows, you'll see a decent boost in CPU and GPU performance, but only for short renders. Anything longer than a few minutes and the amount of RAM you have doesn't matter as much because it's pretty useless if the CPU and GPU are really hot and throttling their performance to stay cool. The 24GB option performed the best here, but again, just like video editing, it's really not an upgrade that makes sense for this particular workflow, which I doubt anyone is doing a lot of on a MacBook Air. Moving on to gaming, even though some synthetic benchmarks showed no difference, I did notice an improvement when playing actual games. For example, Tomb Raider, I was able to get a significantly higher FPS with the 16GB RAM option. And the reason for this is simple. Those synthetic benchmarks don't need much RAM to run, only about 1.5 gigabytes, compared with most actual games like Tomb Raider that can easily use 8 to 10 gigabytes, not to mention the RAM you need just to run your Mac's operating system, which all adds up to about 13.5 gigabytes of RAM total in this example. And this is also why upgrading from 16 to 24 gigabytes made no difference, because the games you'll be playing just don't need that much RAM. Now, all of these tests were done with no other background apps open, and this typically is not indicative of real life, because you'll almost always have other apps and programs open in the background. For example, some browser tabs, Discord, or even Photoshop. And once I repeat some of these same tests with apps open in the background, which all use up some of the available RAM, you can see the difference can increase substantially. In particular, the 8GB RAM version will really struggle and will use a ton of swap memory. Now, I can't go into too much detail here as there are infinite combinations of workflows and background apps. It's just important to note that depending on what apps you have open in the background, it may impact overall performance significantly. So if you are the type of person to have a lot of background apps running while you use your main app, upgrading your RAM is definitely something you should strongly consider. So how about 24 gigabytes of RAM? Who should get this upgrade? Well, I really don't recommend it for many people, especially because 16 gigabytes seems like the best bang for buck in terms of performance gains and price. And like I already showed, if you're doing anything intensive like After Effects, video editing, or complicated Lightroom workflows that need a lot of RAM, you're often better off getting a more professional machine like a 14-inch M1 Pro MacBook. However, if you know for a fact your workflow requires a lot of RAM and is not otherwise intensive on the CPU or GPU, then 24 gigabytes could be a good upgrade for you. For example, developing and coding, you may not see a big difference when compiling code, but for those running applications under Docker or multiple IDEs, for example, they will often need a lot of RAM. Another great example are those who frequently run virtual machines on their MacBook. For example, using software such as Parallels. 24 gigabytes of RAM allows you to assign plenty of RAM to whatever virtual machine you're running, while having plenty left over to run the virtualization program within macOS, and obviously also run macOS itself. Also, if you're a hardcore multitasker, you'll need at least 16 gigabytes, but I would also consider 24 gigabytes. Take me for example. Right now I have about 20 Firefox and 15 Chrome tabs open, the Mail app, Discord, Notion, Slack, Excel, and Photoshop on my 16-inch MacBook Pro with 32 gigabytes of RAM. I'm using about 25 gigabytes of RAM just sitting on the desktop, not actively doing anything. And my MacBook is barely warm, nor is it using much of the CPU or GPU, which means these apps aren't really that intensive, and the only bottleneck is the available RAM to run them all. And if you do anything similar on your MacBook, that 24 gigabyte RAM upgrade is a pretty good option. Now, in case you're wondering if you should upgrade the RAM to 16 gigabytes or the SSD to 512 gigabytes, I always recommend upgrading the RAM first. You might have seen that whole slow SSD controversy for base model M2 MacBooks, which I have made a video on and I will link that below. I do recommend watching that if you haven't already. Because of this though, there have been some people out there recommending to upgrade the SSD instead of the RAM to solve this issue. But that is flat out wrong. I mean, sure, you'll get a faster SSD going from 256 to 512 gigabytes, but it still won't be anywhere near as effective as simply having more RAM. And there you have it. Hopefully this video has answered some of your questions about how much RAM you will need. If you have any questions, let me know down below. But apart from that, I'll catch you in the next one.